Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is S.C. Coleman, author, and today in this video we're going to be talking a little bit about something called 911 services. I'm sure most of us are familiar with this concept. You call into the number 911 and thus you get connected to a dispatcher who will then dispatch something or someone to your location. At least that's the generally thought of concept. But as we'll see in this video, there's a little bit more to it. And as the evidence would suggest, there is an insidious plot behind the existence of this so-called 911 service. Now, if you want to put it into a more simple component, you could think about 911, calling 911, as essentially the ability to call a bannerman or a shield. Of course, I'm referring to the so-called sheriffs, police, highway patrol, security forces, whatever you want to call them. Either way, you call that number on military bases. They're called base police. You call that number, and thus you summon a shield, similar to how a king or an archon, some marshal or some type of general would send out troops to summon to their aid the bannerman, who would of course have the coat of arms, generally speaking, made as a shield. But when we're looking at this idea of 911, we're not just looking at it in the context of what it is, but what the intended purpose behind it is. And looking at the patterns and the activity of today, it is very obvious that there is a mechanized operational transition in the planning, or a strategic transition to the 911 services mechanism of things like individual gun ownership, the ability to protect yourself, and of course the military. Obviously the military is the biggest one. Essentially speaking, every single security mechanism will be encapsulated or wrapped up within the 911 services. Now the ones doing this, and the main hand behind it, is this thing that I referred to as the finance cartel. They're individuals who work together, individuals and groups in some cases, who work together to pull the strings of finance. And in that way, through decentralization and incentivization structures, they can shape the face of the planet. Essentially anything from buildings, corporate buildings, where people live, and even, of course, hills and mountains and desert and all that stuff. It's all shaped by this finance cartel who pull the levers using programs of incentivization and de-incentivization. Those are the terms that they use. Basically, they finance what they want and they don't finance what they do want, or what they don't want. They don't finance what they don't want. Okay, that's a double negative. So they remove funding from what they do not want, or they intentionally do not finance it, and then the ones that they do finance are, the idea is that they will be leveraged to drive out any that are not being incentivized. So that's the financial cartel strategy. Is very simple here. It's a transition to 911 basically. So it all revolves around weapons. Weapons is probably the primary component to this 911 structure. It's not about EMS, it's not about fire departments, and it's not about the caddy wagon, paramedic type of thing, right? It's not about that. It is all and entirely centered around the so-called law enforcement concept, the bannerman or the shield. Essentially speaking, the financial cartel, through their financial structure, are planning and are currently engaged in a strategy to move firearms ownership, and especially the use of firearms, which has to do with bullets primarily, and those materials that make up the composition of bullets. They're moving that away out of the possession of regular individuals and putting it into the sphere of corporate security forces being the only ones that can have them. And those corporate security forces are going to staff your dispatched 911 units. When they are called up and dispatched, when somebody calls 911, there are levels of priority which are chosen by the dispatcher, the person the dispatcher, the person sitting in their chair and taking the phone calls, will be determining on the priority list who to send units to and who gets priority in whichever circumstance. The primary locations that we get focused on as the singular priority would, of course, be what you'd expect, right? You've got finance firms, you would have resource depots. Certain places, of course, would get priority over others. And most people know that if you call 911 and all the resources are currently engaged in and busy with protecting some type of a power plant or something from an alleged attack, then you're out of luck. If you're just like a regular homeowner, if you're in the low income housing bracket, if you're in any of those types of categories, you are very low on the priority list. If there happen to be units available and you call 911, then they'll be sent to your location. But you're not a priority as far as whatever category you're put in. And the dispatchers make that determination. The units themselves do not choose where they get to go and sent to. And as the memorandums of understanding and all the different subset agreements and all the paperwork and evidence suggests, they're all subcontracted security guards from these security firms, of which all those security firms are in turn owned by the financial cartel, which I'm referring to in this context as finance firms, right? You think about the idea of finance firms, holding companies, all of the stuff about asset maneuvering, things like that. That's what I'm talking about. So those people in the finance firms and the holding companies that do all of this maneuverability, most of them own, in one way or another, at this point, all the gun-related companies. Either those selling gun-related paraphernalia, those actually selling firearms, those selling bullets, accessories, etc. When you look into the paperwork, you'll find all of them that are active today are owned by a parent company of a holding company with financial firm listed as their registered agents, if they're not just simply across the board blanket out, have a registered agent or whatever that's part of the so-called National Registered Agents Network, or like the corporation company, that type of thing, right? Just some sort of cover thing that gets put into that spot, which is just supposed to occupy a position, nothing more. So what is the overall strategy operationally? What are the details, right? And I suppose in this context I'm asking myself easy questions so I can look smart, I suppose, but not really. I'm just trying to frame it in the right way. If we're looking at them as adversaries, what is their actual strategy? And it's actually pretty simple, but it is very comprehensive. Essentially, they are currently establishing a state of impoverishment financially and economically in many ways, but mainly by categorically raising the prices across the board of all of these corporations that these finance firms own, right? Through all of their strategic investments. So they're going to, when they pull the trigger on this, basically, what's going to happen is there will be a shortage of bullets. This is my belief. It makes a lot of sense. There will be a bullet shortage specifically. Then there will be exorbitant incentives offered for individuals to, quote unquote, donate their bullets for various benefits, programs, or possibly even outright money to the 911 structure so that they can continue operating. A lot of people wouldn't do this, but then you think about the situation where so many people today are struggling even to buy food because of the categorical raising of prices, the incentivization programs, and the driving out of any sort of independent through licensing and prohibitions on stuff and all whatnot, or outright attack, have pushed out any sort of independent elements, and everything is involved in this corporate financial control structure. Well, somebody will sell their bullets in order to feed their family. And that's the design here. They want it to be so concrete, so well executed that resistance is futile. Most people will sell bullets to get food. And then some people will come down to that conclusion. Am I going to hold on to my bullets, intent on using them if, the seizure happens, which I expect that would be followed next, would be forced seizure for those who refuse to sell. You could, of course, use some of those bullets to go out and hunt, but you're going to be doing what they call poaching, because there's no way that you're going to get a hunting license, even if you had the money to buy one, right? So there will be things like that. People have to come to those decisions. The shortage will be induced, and essentially the way that this is going to happen is that these finance cartel-owned bullet making, manufacturing, and selling companies are all going to declare bankruptcy. They'll all start declaring bankruptcy. We're already seeing it with certain companies, but these are going to happen. A lot of gun companies are going to go out of business, but it's intentional. Those gun companies are owned by these financial cartels. They'll have all their assets moved to some other holding company, usually with this stipulated purpose of only supplying so-called law enforcement components and not civilian or military or anything like that, but just so-called law enforcement, first responder, 911 stuff. That is what the stock of this company that previously sold to the civilian population will move all of its stuff over to a company that will only supply 911 or law enforcement, and then that company, the original companies, will be declared bankrupt and go out of business. So that's the main plan there. Of course, another possibility is that they just move it to a company for holding and storage purposes and not necessarily for use, and that is a planned induced shortage, which they're going to do. So some key words here are state and territory 911 authority structures. This is how you do a lot of research into the evidence that shows this stuff. You've got 911 services boards, of which virtually every structure has it. So think about like what I just said, 911. It's the ability to call to your aid a shield, a bannerman, right? Well, most people assume that it's the chief of police who runs the municipal police force on behalf of the city council. The city council appoints, or the mayor appoints, the police chief. Alternatively, the governor appoints the directors of different statewide law enforcement so-called stuff, and then the president appoints the directors of all of the different federal agencies. That's what most people believe. When in actuality, the 911 services structure is controlled by the 911 services boards. They're a group of people who are appointed by not anyone. I guess they just appoint themselves. They just decide, oh, we're going to do this. And then they get delegated to, they get the authority to operate the so-called law enforcement for the purpose of the continuance of governance and whatnot. By the whichever is the governor or the mayor or whoever. It doesn't matter. The 911 services boards, they're the ones that unilaterally control this structure. That includes the ability to even call 911. When you dial 911 on your phone, the fact that it gets instantly routed to a 911 dispatcher, and that's part of the signal, control of the signal network, that also has to do with the 911 services and is inherently linked to the ability for censorship, the control of communications, and everything else. And this is all of this system is designed for the benefit and for the control of these finance cartels, and not for the individual people living in those locations. Another word to notice is CMRS providers. Sounds similar to an insurance company, but the CRMS providers, you can think of like a staffing agency, which provides the resources to the 911 Services Board. And then those CMRS providers are companies which are all going to be owned by these finance cartels. And so you see essentially the layers that they do. And if you try to dig through them, the rosters are immense. They are significant. You cannot approach this from the idea of taking out one company or another company. It just won't work. There are so many of them. And even if you approached it from the mindset of trying to lock up their financial aspect to try to drive out all the employees and whatnot, it's not, that might work, but it's not necessary. You have to identify the real aspect and strategy, and it is all going to revolve around firearms, as we know. One way that an individual could possibly protect themselves from this strategy is to start making their own bullets, at least reloading or whatnot, maybe stock up on the materials for making bullets, which at this point are a lot cheaper than buying the actual manufactured bullets. But that's really not going to solve the problem, and eventually it will come down to the fact of, you have to choose what you're going to do. And you have to choose to either stand up and fight or roll over and hope for the best. Hope that maybe somebody else fixes it. So we've got the low-income Lifeline program customers. That's an interesting term that I've discovered. So, as I said, the finance companies, they run everything from behind the scenes. They're the finance cartel. And I'll just go ahead and reiterate the basic structural plan of how this works. Finance firms buy firearms companies or create them. They issue 911-based discounts, incentives, and funding programs which are designed to exclude others. In addition, independent gun-related stores and companies are harassed through various ways out of business. Then, systematically, the only ones who will be able to afford bullets and firearms will be security firms which will staff 911 components. It's honestly really simple, and that is the overall operational plan. 911 governance is the ability to call up a shield or bannerman where priority is determined by a dispatcher, or at least the dispatcher is told what the priorities are. Renters, low income, and individual homeowners will be on the lowest priority. And they want to do this in such a way that categorically control of the financial mechanism and structure that resistance will be futile. You will have no choice.